This lesson is on biomes and biodiversity. The biosphere consists of all life on Earth. This includes plants, animals, humans, fungi, bacteria, germs, anything that is living, considered to be alive and has the common characteristics of living things, makes up the biosphere. A biome is a major regional community of plants and animals with similar life forms and environmental conditions. Biomes are classified according to all of the living and non-living factors that interact within them. All right, so this brings us to biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living things that influence a given biome, while abiotic factors are the non-living things that influence a biome. So our living biotic factors are going to be things like plants, animals, bacteria and fungi, disease, organic wastes, and all the interactions between living things. Our abiotic factors are going to be, our non-living factors, they're going to be things like latitude and altitude, temperature, precipitation, soil type, landforms, pH levels of soil and water, any pollution that might be present in the environment, water availability, how much water is there or isn't there, and all the interactions between non-living things or between the living and non-living things. All right, carrying capacity refers to the maximum number of organisms the resources of an ecosystem can support. So each ecosystem is going to have a maximum amount of living things it can support. And not all ecosystems are equal in this regard. If you want to look at the two extremes, let's look at a rainforest compared to a desert. So rainforest is going to obviously support a lot more life. You have a lot of trees and plants and a lot of animal diversity, whereas in the desert you have very few types of plants. Some deserts have literally no plants, and then the animal life is going to be a lot less. So an environment's carrying capacity is limited by those available abiotic and biotic resources and the ability of bacteria and fungi to recycle the residue of dead organisms. So, like I was saying, an ecosystem that has a lot of different types of life, plant life, animal life, bacteria, so on and so forth, it's going to have a larger carrying capacity than an ecosystem that has very few or no plants and very few different types of life. All right, so now we're going to get into the various types of biomes. Here you can see kind of how they are distributed about the Earth. You can take time and look at this on the PowerPoint, but you can see where each of these places are located on the globe. All right, let's talk about the desert a little bit. We've talked before about arid climates. They have very little rainfall, little vegetation, loose, sandy, infertile soil. The plants and animal life that do exist there can be like cacti, brittle bush, Joshua trees, kangaroo rats, coyotes, snakes, lizards, scorpions. Very hardy plants and animals that can exist in these extremely dry conditions. All right, grasslands. These contain very rich soil, grasses, other types of plants. There can be some trees, but they're very sparsely distributed. There's no real forest. You can have trees, but there's like one or two here, a couple here, spread out, like kind of like you see in the picture. You can see some trees in the distance, but there's no real forest in the grasslands. Animal life include bison, rabbits, deer, zebra, lions, warthogs, ostriches, elephants, so on and so forth. All right, the taiga is characterized by needle leaf forests. These areas are cold and wet with very rocky soil. Food shortages in these areas make survival difficult, but there still is quite an abundance of life. We have bears, squirrels, elk, moose, wolves, owls, and bobcats. All right, temperate forests. These are primarily covered by trees in a mild climate with very fertile soil. These areas have four very distinct seasons. We've talked about the seasons and the cause of the seasons and referred to all of the seasons. And in temperate forests, it's very obvious. The differences between summer, fall, winter, spring are very noticeable. Whereas some places like, along the equator, the difference in the seasons is not all that noticeable. Trees lose their leaves in the winter in the temperate forest. This is something we're used to seeing where we live. Animals include squirrels, rabbits, deer, bears, and the like. All right, rainforests, characterized by high amounts of precipitation, high temperatures, lush vegetation. The soil, however, is not very suitable for farming, and that's because a lot of the fertility of the rainforest is tied up in that organic layer that lays on top of the soil. So once the rainforests are removed and that organic layer ceases to exist there, the soil beneath is not very fertile. Rainforests feature a wide diversity of life. They contain many species of life that are deadly and poisonous as well. The rainforest is considered to be a very dangerous place, partly in fact due to those deadly and poisonous species of animals and plants. All right, the tundra. This is a treeless area in the Arctic Circle, and the soil here is consistently frozen. There's little vegetation because of that permafrost, that frozen soil, and it can be really hard for animals to survive here, but mostly you have animals that are going to kind of feed and prey on each other and the sparse vegetation that does exist there. So we can have weasels, oxen, caribou, foxes, and reindeer. All right, moving on now to biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety and number of species in a specific area. The amount of biodiversity in a given biome is directly related to all biotic and abiotic factors present in that biome. So we were talking earlier about how much, what an environment's carrying capacity is depends on the available biotic and abiotic factors. So the greater, trying to think about how to put this, it's just the greater biodiversity you have in an area, the more stable that ecosystem is. And we're going to get more into that in a little bit. The less biodiversity you have, the less stable that ecosystem is. Biodiversity is generally greater closer to the equator and in some mountainous areas. So we're talking about our rainforest areas and then some other mountainous areas having the greatest amount of biodiversity. All right, the importance of biodiversity. I've already stated that an ecosystem that has a wide biodiversity is going to be a lot more stable than an ecosystem without a wide variety of living things. So plants and algae perform photosynthesis. They remove carbon dioxide from the environment and produce oxygen. Humans depend on other organisms for food. Sometimes people haven't thought about this, but everything that we eat was once a living thing, be it a plant or animal or a fungus even. So we depend on other organisms for food, and the more different choices we have, the more food secure we are. So we want to preserve biodiversity because that gives us a lot more options when it comes to feeding ourselves, and the same for all those other animals as well. Again, ecosystems with a lot of biodiversity, they're going to have a more robust food web, and those animals are going to have a lot more options for food to survive on. Biodiversity gives stability to ecosystems. Again, that's what I'm saying. The more biodiversity there is, the more stable that ecosystem is. It enhances their productivity, provides food, medicine, other products. Many of the medicines that we need come from organic compounds that are found in nature. So we really want to make sure we preserve these species because a lot of them are providing chemical compounds that go into our medicine, some of which allow some of us to survive. Some of us rely on medication that we couldn't survive without. All right, let's talk about exotic or invasive species. This refers to a species that is in a region that they're not native to. And this can be a plant or an animal. And this is kind of a common thing, especially now that humans have developed worldwide transportation and practice in a global economy and trade worldwide. So, an exotic or invasive species may have no predators outside of its own native region. So, when it gets inside another region where it doesn't belong, it can be way overly successful, and that will harm other species in that environment. Um, Native species may not have defenses against that exotic or invasive species, and that can be a real problem. This can cause the numbers of species or certain members of certain species to decrease a lot, and sometimes it can cause other species to become endangered. If you have a predator that's in an environment that it doesn't really belong to, and it doesn't have any predators or any limiting factors that would keep it from growing too much in numbers and being too successful, that invasive species can end up overeating. It can reduce the population of other organisms in that environment and cause irreparable damage to that ecosystem's food web. All right, so more on the value of biodiversity. If a species is removed from an ecosystem due to either biotic or abiotic factors, it can have a drastic effect on the entire ecosystem. So, when we say a species could be removed from an ecosystem due to biotic or abiotic factors, let's just use one example for each. A biotic factor could be like an invasive species that came into the area. Let's say an invasive species come into the area, and mice, for example, are something this invasive species prefers to eat. All right, and then this invasive species is really over successful in this new environment, and it eats the mouse population down to almost nothing. You see that this can greatly affect the food web. If this mouse is not there to eat, say, this mosquito, or I'm sorry, if the mouse is not here to eat this grasshopper or this worm or this kind of little grubby looking dude here, these animals can increase in number, right? Or if there's no mice to eat, this is one of this owl's food items, so there's less food for these owls and their numbers can decrease. So if anything happens to any of these organisms in this food web, it's going to affect all the other ones. Now the extent to which it affects all these other ones just depends on how much biodiversity there is. If there's a lot of biodiversity, one of these organisms could be removed from the environment, and the other ones have enough options for food that they're fine. But if you have an ecosystem with very few organisms and very few different types of life, an ecosystem that's not very biodiverse, and you remove one of these organisms, that can cause all the organisms to go away. It's just one of those things. Oh, and I almost forgot to give an abiotic factor. Let's say that there's a lack of rainfall. Precipitation is one of our abiotic factors, and that causes the plants to die out, and that's one of the things at the bottom of the food chain. That affects all these animals up the food chain from it. So species can indeed be removed from an ecosystem due to biotic or abiotic factors. So, yeah, I mean, anytime a species is removed from the food chain, other species are going to suffer. But like I said, if there's a lot of biodiversity, species are likely to, just rely on other sources for food more heavily and be okay. But if the ecosystem does not have a lot of biodiversity, and one of those forms of life is removed from the ecosystem, that could remove all of the other ones from the ecosystem. They could all face a localized extinction. And that brings us to extinction. So extinction is the disappearance of a species because all of its members die off for one reason or another. It's estimated that Earth loses one species per year per million species due to human activity alone. And that's a real problem because all the reasons I've been saying. When we cause a species to go extinct, we've lowered biodiversity in that species' ecosystem and reduced the stability of that ecosystem. Again, 40% of all prescription drugs are made from some sort of living thing, and humans are affected if those plants and animals, if those compounds come from go extinct. All right, let's talk about ethics in terms of biodiversity. So, many people believe humans should be responsible for preserving biodiversity for ethical reasons. You know, a lot of people have different beliefs about how the world came to be and humans' role in this existence. But most people believe the Earth's here and it should be taken care of, and it should we should preserve it, and really that's the only way to preserve ourselves is to preserve our environment and all the other living things in it. I think that sometimes that gets lost with some people. I think that's obvious when you see the pollution that exists out there in nature that everyday people do. The trash you see on the side of the road and things like that. Like people have kind of lost sight of the fact that we're not independent of nature. We actually rely on it. Without nature and what it has to offer us, we cannot survive. Furthermore, species and ecosystems, they really do have a right to exist. It's we really shouldn't spoil these things and overuse them and or purposely destroy nature or its inhabitants. Also, if we lose biodiversity, we lose a lot of things to be fascinated in and a lot of reasons to study the environment. And so on and so forth. I mean, this slide right here is something you could talk about all day. But really, if you want to get down to the heart of it, we need biodiversity to survive. Us humans too. I know we live in buildings and we drive these cars and we're inside a lot and we have air conditioning and we have all these other modern conveniences that make us forget. But we're every bit a part of nature as any of those animals that are out living in the nature and living directly off the land, because all the food we eat comes from nature, the water we drink, all that. We need biodiversity just as much as those other organisms do. All right, human mitigation. So there are some steps that humans have taken to try to preserve biodiversity. Really, I believe we could be doing a much, much, much better job. But here's some of the things. The 1973 U.S. Endangered Species Act lays out a framework for preserving these endangered species. I don't know any other way to put it, but steps that we take to make sure these endangered species can increase in number and no longer be endangered. The United States and other nations established natural preserves and parks, areas that are set aside to be untouched and preserve biodiversity. Some of the bigger national parks we have are Yellowstone, Big Cypress, and Crater Lake. There are many, many other state parks and national parks, way too many to list and mention, but these are great places for preserving this biodiversity, the natural order of things in nature.